The Christian Bible is the best-selling book of all time. It's influenced countless millions of people and in fact had a massive contribution, a massive effect on culture and society over many centuries and indeed millennia. Now, it was a book that was written some 2,000-3,000 years ago. The Bible is divided up into two sections. There's what we call the Old Testament, which is made up of 39 books, and the New Testament, which is made up of 27 books. The Old Testament details the journey of God's interaction with his chosen people, the people of Israel, and his journey with them through the time up until several hundred years BC. The New Testament then takes a story from the coming of Jesus Christ to earth, his life. The first 4 books of the New Testament are stories or biographies about Jesus Christ. Then there's Acts of the Apostles, which talks about the history of the early Christian church. And then there are various other writings and letters and epistles which are written to either individuals or churches in the time of the early Christian era. Now, these were clearly written some time ago. But the thing is that the Bible continues to be, for Christians, an authoritative source for their faith and their practice. The Bible also contains a lot of history, and it contains a lot of specific information which can be referenced from other places and other external sources, so it can be investigated. But this is the question: how seriously can we take the Bible? We know in academic disciplines that if we're dealing with material that's only a decade or 2 old, it's starting to get out of date. There's new advances all the time, particularly in the scientific realm. So how seriously can we take a book that was written 2,000 years ago or even longer ago? See, many people will look at Christians and say, well, look, okay, they base their faith on some book, but the book is very old. The book is out of date. The book is one that, look, surely it's not reliable. It's so old, how do we know how reliable the manuscripts are? Look, at the end of the day, how can we possibly base our faith on some old manuscripts that we don't even believe are reliable? I'm not saying the believers don't believe they're reliable, but skeptics have often looked at the Bible and said, well, look, we don't want to take that very seriously because at the end of the day, it's not reliable. Well, this is a very, very important topic, which I want to unpack, because as we'll see, there is some criteria that we can use to investigate any piece of ancient literature. And this is the question. If somebody says that, and let's take, for example, to start with the New Testament, if we were to take the New Testament, if someone's to say, the New Testament, that's not very reliable, that's just an old book, well, we can answer and say, well, what do you mean? What do you mean it's not reliable? On what basis isn't reliable? In actual fact, the question that can be asked, well, what criteria would you use to evaluate any piece of ancient literature? See, when we take a piece of ancient literature, well, it's not in a vacuum. We don't take, the histories of Caesar or some of the ancient Greek history. It's not as if some of those documents are in major contention. Many of them are much older than the New Testament, but the point is that we don't actually then say, well, look, we've got a major problem with the reliability of the history here. We don't question it. Whereas it seems for some reason, if it's the New Testament, well, that is considered to be dubious. Maybe it's not considered reliable, but the question is on what basis? So what criteria would we use to judge any piece of ancient literature? Well, what I like to do is to propose criteria which we can use for any piece of ancient literature. And what I want to do specifically is then apply these criteria to the New Testament and then see how it stacks up with other literature. Well, let's have a look at these criteria. So these are criteria to test for reliability. Number 1, what does the manuscript claim to be? How close in time is it to the events described? That's number 2. Number 3, how many manuscripts do we have? Number 4, is it eyewitness testimony or second-hand information? Number 5, is it internally authentic? That is there evidence within the text itself that it's actually truthful and reliable? And the 6th one, is it externally supported? Now, these are very good criteria that, as I say, we can apply to any text. But now, let's apply these criteria to the New Testament. Well, to the first of those tests, well, what does the manuscript claim to be? Well, let's look at this passage from 1 John 1:1. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. What's clear, we're not talking about here about a work of fiction. This is a claim that this is an actual version of events of what actually happened. That here we have John, and here he's talking about so he's talking about the disciples. It's a record of their actual interaction with Jesus Christ. It's not some book of mystical theology or religious speculation or some kind of esoteric philosophy. This is a book that is grounded in a person and in the actual events that happened with an individual by the name of Jesus Christ. And it's interesting that they take it a bit further. It's not just a book of history, it's a book of, as it says, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. There's something further here, there's something deeper. The word of life is not just the words on a page about what happened to somebody. This has deeper meaning and impacts people and makes a difference in people's lives. So what we have clearly here is a spiritual book which is designed to reflect history but also impact people's lives. So what's the second test or the second criteria? Well, how close in time is it to the events described? What makes sense is that the closer that we can have the writings to the events, then the more trustworthy it's going to be. If we have a long distance, if this was written hundreds of years or even thousands of years after the event, well, clearly we're going to question the reliability. But if there's a very short gap, then that's something which gives us increasing amounts of confidence. So how close in time is it? Well, the first thing is, we know from various sources of the approximate dates when various books of the New Testament were written. And you can see there a list. We don't need to go through all of them, but the first historical point, we know that Jesus Christ was crucified approximately AD 31. But look when a lot of the books were written, somewhere around 50, 60 AD. A lot of the Apostle Paul's writings, and as well as many of the Gospels too, were written around that time, about 20 years or so after the time that these events actually happened. So the question I would ask then is, if you were to write a history of what happened in the 1990s, would you be able to be accurate? It's a fair question. So what are some of the events that happened in the 1990s? Well, I suppose towards the end of the 1990s we had the whole Y2K bug scare. During the 90s there was a lot of political upheaval, particularly in Eastern Europe. And there was obviously the fall of communism, and there was the time where Gorbachev was there and Yeltsin. When we look at it, there's many different parts of the world where significant things happened. Now let's say, for example, and here, look, let's just take the fall of communism as an example. If someone was to write a book and it was full of lies about what happened, do you think they'd be able to get away with it? No, they wouldn't be able to get away with it. And the reason is fairly straightforward, because if you wrote something that happened 20 years ago, there's many people who are still alive today who would be able to set the record straight if the book was full of lies. And this is interesting. When it comes to the New Testament, the books were certainly circulated, but where people are saying, look, these things didn't happen and these things are untrue. So what we have here is something very interesting. We have books which came out within the lifetime of when objectors could actually speak up and say, hey, no, you got it wrong. What you're saying here is not accurate. But that's not, we actually have no evidence that such a thing happened. So we can be accurate 20 years afterwards. But here, what I want to do is compare some of the ancient manuscripts that we have. So, for example, we've got Caesar's Gallic Wars. It was written in the 1st century BC. The earliest copy that we have is about 900 AD. And the time span, you can see there, the difference is 1,000 years from the time the book was written or the manuscript was written to when we have our earliest copy. So what's that? Time span of 1,000 years. Now, in that time, of course, people can say, well, look, there's a lot of things could have happened. Maybe there were copying errors. Maybe there were deliberate falsifications. Maybe there was some legend that developed in that time. And so people may say, well, hang on, we've got a question mark about this history. Similarly, you can see, and I won't go through all of them, but there are many well-known writings of ancient history, and when we look at the difference between the date when they were written and the earliest copy, in many cases, there's 1,000 years or even greater from when it was written to when we have our earliest copy. Now, Homer's Iliad is an exception. It was written in the 9th century BC. We have the earliest copy about 400 BC, gap of 400 years. That's considered to be exceptionally good by the standards of ancient history. But note the New Testament. 1st century AD, earliest copy, 2nd century AD. We have less than 100 years to a fragment. Now, in actual fact, we'll see in a moment it's much less than 100 years to a fragment. And we've got the complete New Testament in less than 250 years. In fact, we have very large parts of it within 100 to 150 years. When we consider the early manuscripts that we have for the New Testament compared with other ancient literature, it's just second to none. It's outstanding. Now, let's have a look at some of these manuscripts and some of the fragments. One of the ones which is particularly interesting is the John Rylands fragment. It's a manuscript. It's at the University of Manchester in the UK now. It's dated in the very early part of the 2nd century, somewhere between 115 and 130 AD. It contains several verses from the book of John. Now, this is really significant. You may recall that the Gospel of John was indeed the latest written. People have dated it variously, but some people will date it at AD 70, 80, and some even later than that. But it's certainly later than the other books. Now, the difference between approximately AD 80 and 115, 130, look, we're talking somewhere around between 35 and 50 years. It's much less than 100. It's actually within a generation of when it was written. This is something which is outstanding evidence, and as I mentioned, this is something very rare in ancient manuscripts. Now we have the Bodmer Papyrus. It's at Geneva. Now it's dated in the mid to late part of the 2nd century, and it contains almost all of the Gospel of John. And then, just a little while later, we've got the Jester Beatty Papyrus at Dublin. It's dated around AD 200, and it contains large parts of the New Testament. Now, if it's not the manuscripts themselves, what is interesting, we also have the writings of the church fathers. These are the early church leaders, where they're dated from around AD 100, and they contain quotations from, it makes perfect sense, they quoted from the New Testament. So clearly the New Testament was in existence prior to their writings, and they quote from the Gospels, they quote from other of the writings and materials, and we can actually reconstruct significant parts of the New Testament from their writings which are external to the New Testament itself. So when we consider the early dating and the evidence for the early dating, it's exceedingly strong for the New Testament. Now, one of the reasons why we can have these manuscripts which are so early is because of the climate there in Judea, which is it's hot and it's very dry, and it's just perfect for the preservation of manuscripts. And actually, we'll come back to this point a little bit later when we talk about a very exciting discovery which was made not that long ago. Now, the next criteria, the third one, is how many manuscripts do we have? Now, it might be nice if we've got a fragment or two here or there, but how many do we have? Look, is it one or two fragments? Is it, a few hundred? Is it thousands? Because that can help us also in trying to work out how reliable a document is. Because if it's just one, we've got nothing else to compare it to, we can't actually compare its accuracy. Well, this is where it's interesting. Look, this is the table that we looked before, but I've added 2 extra columns at the end, where it's an issue of how many manuscripts. So when we look at Caesar's Gallic Wars, Sure, there's a time span of 1,000 years, but there's about 10. There's 10 copies in existence. And so we go down. Interestingly, Plato, Tetralogies, there's 7 copies. Catullus, there are 3 copies. Now, when we look at the accuracy of those copies, we actually don't know. You know, we think there's reasonable accuracy, but it's very difficult to put a percentage accuracy on those. When we look at Homer's Iliad, well, it's not only got about a 400-year span, but it has 643 copies, which is the second most in ancient literature. And when you look at that, what is found is that there's 15,600 lines of that work, and 764, there's some doubt in terms of what was actually the authentic original. But nevertheless, it actually is very high accuracy. There's 95% accuracy in terms of the text of Homer's Iliad. Now, what about the New Testament? Now, the New Testament, there's not 643 copies, or 3 or 7. There's approximately 25,000. Now, here we're talking about not complete copies. I mean, these are fragments. Basically, these are, some of them are complete New Testaments. Some of them may be books or large sections or smaller sections. But altogether, there are 25,000. In fact, there's more than 25,000 of these manuscripts or fragments. And we're talking about ancient ones. We're not talking ones that are just a few hundred years old. These are copies that are in the first few hundred years of the Christian era. Now, when we look at accuracy, I mean, it's just outstanding. By ancient terms and ancient documents, I mean, 95% is exceptionally good for Homer's Iliad. But in the New Testament, it's well in excess of 99%. There are only a few words or phrases where there's variations between some of the ancient manuscripts, and so then it's a matter of reconstructing how that they should be best, and that's a whole area of textual criticism. But greater than 99% is just outstanding. And as F.F. Bruce once said, when you look at some of the variant readings, there's none of them that actually have any significant impact on any major doctrine of the Christian faith. So here we're talking about largely in very small minutiae, which is absolutely outstanding. When we look at the New Testament, in comparison with any other piece of ancient literature, its textual evidence is second to none. It is just totally outstanding. Well, let's have a look at a fourth test. Is it eyewitness testimony or second-hand information? Why is this relevant? Well, if we have second-hand information, it's essentially hearsay. And as we know, in terms of evidence in a court of law, well, if it's second-hand information or hearsay, guess what? It's not admissible. But eyewitness testimony is. So eyewitness testimony actually is very strong. But this is what the New Testament says again and again and again. And here, let's just look at 2 examples of it. Acts 10, verse 39. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They're saying they saw it. They were there. There's no question there. Here's another one, 2 Peter 1:16. We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Now, these are only 2 texts. There are dozens that we could come up with. In fact, the way that the New Testament is written, it is eyewitness testimony through again and again and again. There's no question that the writers claimed to have first-hand experience of the events that they were talking about, something which is very significant. Now, the 5th test. Is it internally authentic? That is, when we look at it itself, the text itself, is there material in the text which demonstrates that this has reliability in it? And again, we're just to have 2 examples of some texts that actually show us that. This is a passage from Luke chapter 3, the first 2 verses. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. There's a lot of information in here, isn't there? When you look at that, let's just say that's completely different to what you could expect of some sort of philosophical treatise or some kind of poetic description of some symbolic spiritual truths. This is something which is rooted and grounded in history. This is something that can be evaluated. This is something that can be examined. There can be external sources that look at this. You can judge this piece of writing and come to a determination of whether it actually is coherent, whether it actually tells the truth. This is something that can actually be disproven as being false as well by other history which is out there. And this is just one example. There are dozens and dozens of examples, because that's what the book of Acts is. It is a history, and it has places, and it also has people in there. It's interesting when you look at Luke. For many years, this was about 100 years ago, many of the critics would actually look at Luke and say, well, no, Luke, look, he got a lot of stuff wrong. He's not a very good historian. The problem is that biblical archaeology and other discoveries have found more and more evidence such that now Luke is considered to be one of the finest of historians. It's interesting, as more and more evidence comes through, it establishes more and more the reliability of the writings there. So here we have in Luke chapter 3. Notice how detailed that information is and how easy it would be to cross-check this, because here we're not talking about some people who were somewhere hidden that nobody's ever heard about. We're talking about some prominent rulers and prominent people that have been, and it's been corroborated by other findings in archaeology and history. Now, interesting there, we can date this passage very specifically in the year AD 27. So that's how pinpoint, that's how accurate we can do it, because of material which is very clearly written there in the New Testament. Now here's another one. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, we spoke a little bit about this, of course, in our earlier session. And that is that if 20 years after an event, you've got hundreds of people who are eyewitnesses of an event, they can corroborate what you've said. So the thing is that you're not going to write that sort of thing and circulate it, and all of a sudden you've got these people saying, no, well, this didn't happen. But rather you've got hundreds of people who can corroborate, who can support what is happening, and who can say, yeah, this is what happened. I was an eyewitness. I saw it. Because what Paul was really doing there is putting out the challenge, essentially saying, if you don't believe me, there's these hundreds of people who can back up exactly what I was saying. And then the sixth test is it externally supported. And this, of course, looks at things like other historians who are outside of the New Testament, as well as archaeology. Now, there are many ancient historians who corroborate events recorded in the New Testament, and some of those are some of the names which are very well known in ancient literature. Names such as Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, Pliny the Younger, etc. And they're just four examples who are very well known. But in addition to the writers who corroborate events, there are many archaeological sites that we can do which actually back up. These are exactly the places where Jesus was, where the early apostles were, where the Apostle Paul was. Now, here's an example. This is a 3rd century AD synagogue at Capernaum. Now, interestingly, it was built on a 1st century site, and this is where Jesus cured the man with an unclean spirit. It's interesting when you're there, because not only does it look ancient, but what there is underneath, and I guess for obvious reasons they haven't destroyed the one on top to look at the one underneath. But at the time of Jesus, Jesus would have worshipped right there in the 1st century synagogue, which is right under what we can see there. Now, what is interesting is that right nearby there is the house of Peter at Capernaum, where Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. In fact, right above it, there's a massive church, a modern church, which has been built there. But this is one of the best established places in ancient history in terms of the early Christian church. Because it's interesting, there's an object of Christian veneration in the 1st century. In fact, there's been found, Christian graffiti dating from the 1st century. Why? Because there would be Christians who would come there as pilgrims to have a look at these places in Capernaum, where Jesus lived. And what was clear, that it was known that this was the house of Peter, and it was known that Jesus performed a miracle there. And this is, as I say, one of the very firmly established sites where it was clear that Jesus was here, and this is where he performed one of his miracles. The Pool of Bethesda, where Jesus healed a crippled man. It's actually quite a spectacular place seen there. It's right there in Jerusalem with some very impressive ruins. But that's a place down where the water is. And it's a pool there, and look, it's there. It's in existence today. This is a pool of Siloam where Jesus healed a blind man. Again, you can walk there today, and it's clearly identified. Very near, actually, another fascinating place, which is Hezekiah's Tunnel. But that's a whole different story and from the Old Testament. Here we have the tribunal at Bema at Corinth, where Paul was tried. Again, fascinating place, right there. And this is where Paul would have made one of his speeches there. And you can visit there. In fact, I had the privilege of being there just this last month on the way back from Ukraine. Here's the meat market at Corinth as well, there, preserved, and you can see, some of the city of Corinth with actually in the background, you can see one of the famous temples there. The temple of Artemis at Ephesus, that was considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Not much of it has remained there, but it was a temple which was massive in scope. I've forgotten the exact dimensions, but I think it was somewhere over 100 metres under a roof. But this was a huge temple, and it was really considered one of the wonders there. But you can go there and you can have a look at, well, not a lot that's left, but look, it's a place there that's clearly there now. This is the theatre at Ephesus, where the riot of silversmiths occurred. There again, spectacular there in terms of the amphitheatre and just the whole scenery around. But clearly, Ephesus is one of those fascinating places that the Apostle Paul spent a lot of time at, and you can see some of the structures and some of the places where he actually was and where he would have addressed crowds and made speeches. Now, before we go on to the Old Testament, so there's a lot that we've said about the New Testament. We've looked at the different tests that we can make into the reliability. These are the tests we can apply to any document, but as we've applied it to the New Testament, we find that there's incredible evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. In fact, there are scholars in this area who've looked at the textual criticism and they've looked at the various evidence there, and they've come to the following startling conclusion. And that is that if we are to question the reliability of the New Testament, then we call into question the entire body of literature of the ancient world. So it's a big statement. It's a huge claim. But what they're essentially saying, in other words, is that there is more evidence, in fact, much more evidence for the reliability of the New Testament than there is for any other piece of ancient literature. And so if anybody then says, well, look, the New Testament, we can't take that seriously, it's not reliable, hang on a minute. If you're going to say that, well, you've just about destroyed the literary body of evidence in antiquity. And this is it. What we can be confident is that there is impressive evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. And that is significant because we can be confident of it not just in terms of its history and in terms of its geography and its historical factuality, but of course then that gives us confidence to take on board the spiritual claims that the book makes, which is actually, when we consider the purpose of it, really the main purpose it was written. It wasn't there primarily as a book to convey history and geography, although it does it, and it does it very well, but it had another purpose, and that is to make a difference in each one of our lives so that we may know Jesus Christ and through him have salvation. Now, then we come to the Old Testament. Is it reliable? Up until about 70 years ago, it was considered that the Old Testament had real problems with reliability. Why was that? Well, because it was written some hundreds of years before the time of Jesus Christ. And the earliest manuscripts that we had were at least 1,000 years after these books were written. So you can see the problem we've highlighted in the previous section on the New Testament. That if we have, a big gap, people were saying, well, look, how do we know that it wasn't tampered with? How do we know that, there weren't, errors in copying? And how do we know? How can we have confidence that what we have in the Old Testament is something that, we know is accurate? Well, this all changed in Qumran, which is in Israel, contemporary Israel. There's some cave. You've probably heard the story. 1947, there was a boy who was out there, as boys do, throwing stones, and he threw it into a cave and he heard something shatter. Went to investigate and found these pots. And in those pots, I guess there weren't riches, in the sense of gold or precious stones, but there were these manuscripts. And these manuscripts then led to a flurry of activity and excitement in the academic world, because as they were then studied, it took many years for them to be studied, it was found that amongst, and they were preserved by a religious community at the time, but in amongst their writings, there were fragments from every book of the Old Testament, except for the book of Esther. And in fact, there was what they call the Isaiah scroll, which was essentially the complete Isaiah. And so the scholars were very interested to know whether indeed the text had changed in the 1,000 years since. What's fascinating is they went and they compared the texts. They found that the text from the Dead Sea Scrolls was almost identical to what they had 1,000 years later. And so on that point, the critics actually were silenced because that was no longer a valid criticism. What we could see there is that before the time of Christ, because these manuscripts were dated in many cases the 2nd century BC, so between 100 and 200 years before the time of Christ was where most of these manuscripts have been dated. And they demonstrate very clearly that before the time of Jesus Christ, these manuscripts are there, which are very similar to the ones that we had. Now, the important thing is, of course, that Jesus quoted from the Old Testament scriptures. And so that we have records of those even before the time of Christ, so that we know that we can have a lot of confidence in the reliability of the Old Testament. Now, coming back to, I guess, the question we posed initially, and I've touched on again, why were all these things recorded? And I think we look at this passage in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, it again re-emphasises the purpose of the Bible. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's really the purpose of the Bible, is not to give us history, although it's a very reliable history. It's there to tell us about Jesus Christ. It's to then tell us how we can come to know him and how we can be saved through accepting what he has done for us. See, Jesus Christ is the solution to problems that we have in life. In actual fact, as you look through the Bible, you look through what the gospel writers have written, you look at what Jesus himself said. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He presents himself as the one through whom we can have that reconciliation with God. He is offering us a way that we can be reconnected with God and we can have a future which is bright, which is glorious, full of hope, which is optimism, and what's more, one that even death on this earth can't finish because he offers eternal life. So, as we look at the Bible, in terms of reliability, I think we can be very confident that what we have are words which are inspired, words which are from God, words which can have a massive impact on our lives and the lives of others. So yes, the Bible is a Bible we can take seriously.